Thank you all for coming today. On behalf of Kathy Whitlock, who is unfortunately unable to make it because she's at the Yellowstone Biennial Scientific Conference, I'm happy to introduce Elizabeth Shanahan. My name is Sandra Cavalieri, and I'm a program coordinator at the Institute on Ecosystems. We're really pleased to have Liz today to talk to us about citizen perspectives on climate change, which is maybe one of the most pressing issues of our time, if not the most pressing issue of our time. Liz has her Doctor of Arts from Idaho State University, which she received in 2005. She also has a Master of Public Administration from Idaho State University and a Master of Counseling, which is probably extremely important skills in this work that you're doing. Also from Idaho State University, and Bachelor's in Comparative Literature from Dartmouth College. And she's going to tell us in detail about what she does, but her research focuses on policy narratives and how the policy narrative influences the policy process. She's done a lot of work in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem on contentious issues of bison management, wolf reintroduction, snowmobile access, and now she's focusing her part of her research effort on climate change at the local, state, and national level. So I'm really excited to hear the presentation. We also have a number of people online, and so we'll look forward to that and to the Q&A at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sandra. I think I need to update my bio. Cool. So it's funny listening to it. I haven't thought about this in a while, but it's probably not a good way to start a presentation with a caveat, but here I go. It might sound odd because in the natural and physical sciences, you have a trajectory probably from early college on up through your PhD. And I have had a pretty circuitous route from comparative literature to counseling to Masters of Public Administration to political science. And there are theoretical students that run through that trajectory that really center on story. So in comparative literature, I was studying stories, French feminist stories at the time, and postmodern kinds of theories. And when but I continued on the way, and literature, while interesting, does not a career make often. Sorry, English majors out there. So, and I come from New Hampshire, and I come from a very political family. So it was a natural sort of step over into politics, because politics is all about stories. So many of you here do a lot of really high-powered, very sophisticated work on very, sometimes narrow ideas to advance knowledge. And in political science, that is sometimes the case, but we more broadly are trying to understand power, and in this case, or in my case, how the stories we tell influence different decisions. So that's sort of generally what I do. What I wanted to do today is a little bit, a few degrees separated from that, in that I figured that with the new HELP lab, the Social Science Research Lab, that is coming into fruition thanks to some hard work from Eric Riley, who walked in. I don't know who you are, Eric. Here you are. And Linda Young, and I know Jamie and Julia and Kathy from Earth Sciences are not here. They emailed me and said they're busy. But this was a collective effort to get this lab up and running. And so what I thought I would do today is have sort of a parallel process talk with you all about social science and how we do what we do, and then also the content, which is climate change and citizen opinion. Sound good? All right, and it's odd that I don't know many of you, and we work at the same university, so that's telling in a sad way. So how I thought about approaching this is pretty simple. I think there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to leave 20 minutes, 20, 25 minutes maybe for some discussion. But what I wanted to do is just present what is classic political science. Our bread and butter is polling, it's surveys. Sometimes we do it well and sometimes we do it poorly. But we often will stand on some of the knowledge that is brought forward out of these traditional venues. So I want to talk about Gallup just by way of example. We have a lot of different kinds of data sets. You've probably heard of like the American National Election Studies or the General Social Survey. These are big national efforts to collect national level social science data on a variety of issues. Gallup in particular has since 1998 done a yearly survey, environmental survey, and they ask climate change questions. So I just want to show you some of how they've asked those questions. Again, that's talking about how we operationalize our concepts, how we collect our data. And then I want to talk about a survey that a graduate student and I worked on last year that focused more specifically, well, it focused on climate change opinion, but also on this role of knowledge and different forms of knowledge. And I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And then takeaways like, so what do you do with all this information? So in thinking about, or in looking at the Gallup polling, they do, without going into too much details on their methodology, they do a national survey. And a national survey can be anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200, which is a little surprising, but that is the case. And they say that this is a representative sample. I'm not sure of all the stratifications, certainly, you know, gender, region, age. So the surveys that we're talking about here, you'll see a timeline from about 1998, sometimes 2001 to present, to 2014. These surveys are conducted in March, and you can go onto their site and see them. So, citizen opinion. Obviously, the first thing you have to do is define what we're talking about by opinion. And there are different dimensions. These are some of what Gallup has done in terms of trying to capture what the general public is thinking about climate change. So here we have concern about climate change, and this is their actual question. Please tell me if you personally worry about this problem a great deal, a fair amount, only a little, not at all. Classic social science, 4 to 5, maybe 7-point Likert scale. Categorical data, right? So which obviously delimits some of the inferences we can, or associations or statistical analyses we can make based on these kind of data. So they ask about how worried are we, right? They ask about the cause. We're all really interested, you know, so do people think climate change is happening? Do people think it's human caused, anthropogenic? Is it natural? So what are the causes? So this is their question. Do you believe increases in the Earth's temperature over the last century are due more to human effects or natural changes in the environment? And methodologically, when these questions are asked, randomly they're flipped so as to prevent any kind of first response bias. Attitude about the threat. These results are pretty interesting. So is climate, actually I say climate change here. They use the word global warming, which I'll footnote as being, there's some debate over whether people will respond to the same questions differently, whether you say climate change or global warming. And so this is actually incorrect. This should say global warming. So is global warming a serious threat to you or your way of life in your lifetime? And then finally, belief. Belief about news information. A lot of you, I'm not really sure how you disseminate your information. Obviously, you get rewarded for being in peer-reviewed journals. I'm not sure how much you disseminate your information elsewhere, how much the media calls you, how much you're quoted, how often you might put together an editorial, how often you might have a conversation with a legislator. So how they define news, I'm not exactly sure, but they ask the question of belief in terms of this news information. Is it exaggerated, correct, or overestimated? Classic social science, survey questions. we'll talk about qualitative data in a little minute. So I just want to give you, again, a brief overview of some of these national level results before I go into our work here. So here's the concern. And I don't know, so what do I do as a social scientist? I can report these numbers and I can interpret these numbers. And it's the interpretation that is subjective, right? So we have, one interpretation is between 1990 and 2014, hasn't been a lot of change in the concern. Another way you can look at this is we have these really weird spikes. What's happening during those times? I don't know. Let's see. We had a tsunami in the Indian Ocean here. We had Katrina in 2005, Japanese tsunami in 11, Sandy in 12. So you could go back, take this data and go back and see what's happening in context. So another way to interpret this data is to say public opinion is really volatile depending on what's happening, what the event is at the time that these questions are asked. People are really interested, again, in this idea of human activities. Is the cause human or natural? Lots of different ways to interpret this. There is a gap, obviously, and oddly, since 2001, it is narrowing. And why I say oddly is that it's narrowing even though we are even probably more certain in terms of our science.
I was just wondering, Liz, if you went back one, would you also look at who's president? And
yes, that's another sort of way to look at the context of what's happening in our nation and who is elected. So, we have Obama, right? And now we have some executive orders. We'll see how people respond to climate change executive orders in terms of concern. But yes, those are basically independent kinds of contextual variables to take a look at. These are just simply descriptive statistics, right? It doesn't say, it's only descriptive. There's no association as of yet. We'll get to that in a minute. And certainly no prediction yet. Now this I find both interesting and concerning. So here, the top line is, do you think that global warming is going to happen during your lifetime? And so a lot of people are saying yes, whether it's natural or anthropogenic, yes. However, will it pose a serious threat to your life? And again, I don't know if this is statistically different or not, but how I would interpret this is to say yes, people do think global warming will see these effects, but it's not going to affect me. And I don't know how many of you folks were here when Lori Young, who I think is online, talked about the interview she did in the Big Hole. That's exactly what she found in talking to, Lori, I hope I'm not misrepresenting your work. What she found in talking to ranchers is that, yes, there's this concern, but it's not going to necessarily be in their backyard. It's a concern that's out there, but I'm going to be okay. That's significant, I think. And then finally, belief in information. And this is news information. We're seeing a stronger result in people feeling like news is exaggerated. And again, sort of contextually, so when has our, what do they call this? When you watch ideologically driven news, so you watch sort of the head not bobbing kind of news outlet, and so you watch news that is in agreement with your standing. So you have sort of the syndicate news decreasing, and you have the MSNBCs and Fox increasing. But we do have, in general, an increase in people thinking that news is exaggerated. How are you going to communicate information, right? If news isn't information, if news is exaggerated, we lose a really big conduit of communication with this perspective on the part of citizens. So that was just descriptive, right, of these different ways to operationalize climate change opinion. But now the interesting, obviously, part comes in when you're looking at, so why? Like, what are the effects? Why is this happening? Why do these differences occur? And without going into, well, actually, Gallup offers no statistics. I think you can buy their data set and do your own statistics. Age and education don't really matter. There's no difference statistically, but politics matters. And not that this is surprising to anyone in this room. Politics matters. So if you look across the belief in the cause, 59% of Republicans say it's natural, 79% of Democrats say it's human. In terms of concerns, Republicans, 63% say it's a little or no concern, 56% of Democrats say they have a great deal of concern. It's the attitude question, serious threat of life. 81% of Republicans say no, 56% of Democrats say yes. And belief that the news is exaggerated, kind of interesting here, right? 68% of Republicans say yes and 49% of the Democrats say it's underestimated. So what does this mean? As a political scientist, what does politics mean? Politics is this idea of value difference and value struggle. And we think about, political scientists love 2x2s. So you think about different dimensions. There are economic and social dimensions, and this is in part what is the basis for our differences in political ideology. So if you really are opposed to government intervention in the economic sphere, you tend to be libertarian or conservative. If you tend to want those social supports in the economic sphere, you tend to be populist or liberal. So there are values that anchor why we're so different, Republicans and Democrats. Now these are parties. It's a little bit different when you're talking about ideologies. But I will also say, this is sort of drawing on the work of Martin Nye at U of M. He had a really great piece where he talked about policy surrogates. And so climate change and the climate change debate, as you know, I'm not saying anything you don't know, it's just backed up with some data, that the climate change debate is mired, it is full-blown in this political wrangling, and we see it more at the federal level than we do at the local level by way of how many policies are actually passed. And so it's less of a political issue at the local level. Obviously, it's intractable at the federal level, and hence we have executive orders. So Martin Nye talks about this as a policy surrogate, and it's a federalism policy surrogate, that the issue isn't climate change, the issue is get the feds off my back. And so this is where some of this very strong leaning Tea Party and Republican perspectives are coming from.
Given the fact that, or to the extent I understand it to be a fact, that the fraction of folks who vote are considering themselves independent, and that fraction is growing, how, in these Gallups, where did the independents shake out there?
They have, it's a good question, and this is also how the question is asked. So you're asking a great methodological question too. So you have strong conservative, strong liberal, leaning conservative, leaning liberal, moderate conservative, moderate liberal, something like that. And so there are some ways that the questions are asked where you're going to get 3 Democrats, Republicans, Independents. There are some questions where it's going to be dichotomous. I think if this is why when in the survey that I'll show you, we didn't ask political party. We asked about how do you see yourself leaning ideologically. And that way we take care of the independent problem. Or not that's a problem, but so I want to keep moving on here to our survey. So we just did a pilot survey. This is a master's student, and she executed the survey. We worked on the survey together, and wanted to do a traditional analysis here of climate change opinion, but we also wanted to add in a different variable. What's been happening with some folks like Alan Leiserowitz, and some folks out of Yale who worked on the Cultural Cognition Project as well. They're really working, and Eric is actually going to go speak on at Yale on his public will work with some of these climate change folks. And it's the idea of how do we account for these values in opinion formation. And what we've done in this survey is try to account for different ways of knowing, and I'll talk about what that means, how we've defined that in a bit. But they're, basically the idea is that we do have these filters through which information passes, and so the same information can come to me, can go to you, Sandra, but we would understand it, feel about it, think about it differently depending on what those filters are. So let me just talk a little bit about our traditional sort of analyses. So we had the survey, it was a long survey. I think we had about 385 responses. So again, we're really testing some questions too, because we have a White Park Pines survey coming out, hopefully January. And so some of these questions were a test run on how to operationalize climate change opinion, for example. So I didn't want just one question on climate change, so we had 12 actually. And so this is, again, social science methods. Instead of just having one question of a Likert scale, 4 points or 7 points, you can ask a bank of questions that get at the same, that get at a concept, and the concept in this case being the dependent variable of climate change opinion. So here's an example, for which I will need my glasses. So we had them answer 12 questions on a 5-point scale to say whether the statement was very compelling, somewhat compelling, neutral, not very compelling, or not at all compelling. So here's an example of a statement. Global mean surface air temperatures over land and oceans have increased over the past 100 years. How compelling is that? We didn't say true or false. We're getting at a belief. And a belief, you can have a belief no matter what the objective reality is. Right? There's nothing especially unusual about today's temperatures. The Earth's climate is constantly changing, and climate shifts have been far more dramatic in the past. So we took these 12 questions, built this scale variable, did a reliability test, and in social sciences, I don't know what it is in other disciplines, but in the social science, taking Likert scale categorical variables, making it into an interval variable, as long as we get it over a 0.8, we're good to go. So, and here's the distribution. So, I know this isn't a very good graph, sorry. The lower the number, the more believer you are. The higher the number, the more skeptical you are. Obviously, I just cut and paste that. I'm a little embarrassed about that. But so what do? We took the traditional independent variables, age, political views. So that is that leaning conservative, or strongly conservative to strongly liberal. Urban rural is important in Montana, I think. We went ahead and threw in gender just to see. Now, importantly, religion is not in here, and it's not in here for not a very good reason, frankly. So I do think that political views and religion co-vary. However, about religion, higher level of review, and this is a master's student, so I just went with what I was going to get. So we wanted to develop this new independent variable that I am Philip are calling knowledge orientation. So there are different theories out there, cultural cognition kinds of theories that have identified how people, what those filters, how do you name those filters that information passes through and how that affects how people hear and understand information. We did it a little bit differently here. And Pew, and now this is 2009, Pew did this study that, and they reported out that 84% of scientists, this is not surprising, 84% of scientists said that climate vulnerability is due to human activity. Maybe that is a surprise that 16% said it wasn't, but 84% of scientists said climate variability is due to human activity. 49% of those who don't associate themselves as being a scientist or non-scientists, 49% said that climate variability is due to human activity. So there's a really big difference between public understanding and scientific understanding. We're not tracking. The public is not tracking what science is. No problem. So public understanding is not, has not kept track, right, with scientific understanding. And why? Lots of people say, well, because climate change is complex. Hard to understand. Well, we wanted to just put our toe in the water to test. We don't dispute that. But we also want to put our toe in the water for different ways of knowing. And how we did this, and there are some criticisms to this for sure, but how we did this was, well, kind of requires this sort of philosophy of science kinds of questions, right? So most of you, as natural physical scientists, you probably don't even question what is called your ontology and epistemology, right? You remember philosophy of the science from back in the day. I'm sure you all had it in your PhD programs. So ontology is what is truth, and from a science perspective, truth is discoverable, and the whole goal is to get to a law. And so you have the knowledge that is built on observable knowledge, and this is where so much critique comes in from, and misunderstanding comes in on the part of natural physical scientists with regard to social science, qualitative research also that does rely on latent understandings as well as manifest understandings. So since modernity, right, since Galileo, we have been riding this wave of the scientific revolution, right? The only way we can understand, the only way we build knowledge is through observation. It's no longer from the divine, so we've moved on from the, well, in theory, we've moved on from that. But there are, when you think about MSU and what our students are, what kinds of courses our students are in, yes, we have students who are in sciences, and we have students who are in humanities and social sciences. And so part of it is that these disciplines have different ontological and epistemological orientations. So in sociology, now this isn't true for David Idle and Tammy, but a lot of heavy-hitting sociologists are qualitative researchers. So their ontology is much more pluralistic, right? That you can actually have competing truths, and the way that you discover knowledge is really contextual, and it's through words and understanding people. So what Kelly Mildenberger, who is a dynamite student, she's now up in northern Montana, but she came up with this proxy for different ways of learning, or different ways of knowing rather, is to do in the survey, one of the independent variables being, so those students who are in the sciences, who are full-blown in this ontology of, observation and truth-seeking, and then other students who are more in the humanities and in the qualitative research realm. So it was a proxy, basically, which major they were as to what their different knowledge orientation would be. So we did a regression. For better or for worse, right? We did a regression. Some interesting results here. I mean, this is the traditional thing, right? This is what political scientists who went from case studies in the up to the 40s to in the 50s at Yale would walk around in white lab coats by way of trying to be legitimate. So we have this whole discussion in political science on how to build knowledge. We do it quantitatively, we do it qualitatively. So remember, the dependent variable is climate change opinion. It had a range from, well, let's see, what was it, like a 51 or 48-point range. Oddly, age came out significant, but I wouldn't take that really with any sort of muster. The younger, interestingly though, the younger, therefore more skeptical, but our sample is mostly young people, so I would really take that one with a grain of salt. Obviously, political views, this is exactly what, not surprising, it sort of flies off the page at you. This mirrors what Gallup has found, that if, you know, the more conservative you are, the more skeptical you are. In terms of our urban-rural, rural people tend to have stronger beliefs in climate change. Yeah, that not that surprising, especially as we get into some of the other questions that we ask in terms of our agricultural students, right, who know it on the landscape. And then in terms of what I call this knowledge orientation, the stronger you are in the sciences, or the more you are an empiricist, the more you are convinced that climate change is occurring.
You glossed over gender?
Oh, gender. Yeah. Oh, I didn't actually write that down. So let me think about male, zero, positive. Yeah, again, there were more males than females who took the survey. I have to do my positive, so males in the sciences, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, so males, the more male you are, right, the stronger your belief in climate change is. But my guess is that probably co-varies. If I didn't look at it, it probably does there's probably some like linearity right there, too. So Kelly, my graduate student, wanted to do some further inquiry, which was super great. She wanted to understand what kind of relationship there was between knowledge orientation and how compelling and how trustworthy different forms of knowledge and communication are. And so she came up with both written and verbal forms of communication. I'm not going to read all of this to you. And these were flipped, or randomly flipped here. So she had the students read each of these. So this is actually came from an interview she did with a farmer. And this is from a Rutgers report. We got at Rutgers University. So what's here on the slide considered A, this is what she would call sort of experiential or citizen observation kind of knowledge, and B being very scientific. She also tested visual communication, and she had a few of these. So maps that you guys do. I don't have like a curve or anything here, but also this tells a story that is different from the story. Well, it's not different from the story, but it tells a story in a different way. But she wanted to find out how compelling people responded to this and how trustworthy each of these ways of communicating was based on their knowledge orientation. And there's too many tables, so I'm just going to, if you want to see it, well, we'll get it out for publication here soon, but I have the manuscript to date. I want to fit the actual statistics. But there is a statistically significant association between knowledge orientation, right? Whether you're more of an empiricist scientist or whether you're more qualitative, maybe even qualitative, and how compelling and trustworthy these communications were. So those with positivist orientation found that these data-driven communications, so the Rutgers communication as well as the MAP, they rated these compelling and trustworthy. And this was just simple Likert kinds of how compelling, how trustworthy. Those who are more a qualitative or post-positivist knowledge orientation identified these, the more observation or experiential communications as compelling. But interestingly, the trustworthiness, both forms. This is important. This is important for what we were talking about earlier. What is compelling and what is trustworthy, right? And I think if partly what we need, if we want to close that gap between, public understanding and scientific advancements, we need to get to compelling with what we talk about as scientists. So what she did, this is another really cool thing about social science, is so these are just Likert scale questions we can report on, we can run some statistics on it. Qualitatively, we can also ask why. And these respondents were great. We had a lot of qualitative data. I'm going to run through this pretty fast because I want to end for questions. But what in qualitative work, and Kelly did this work here. What qualitative work is that you read these comments, and then she come up with these 3 different concepts of why these students found these different kinds of communication compelling and trustworthy. So I'll go into some quotes for each of these. Relatable, that these communication pieces they related to them. Some talked about use of scientific evidence, and others talked about diverse perspectives. So let me just run through these fairly quickly. Personal alignment, personal feel, emotional appeal. These personal alignment came across both the scientific communication as well as that personal observation communication. But this idea that what was communicated had some kind of a personal connection, agrees with my type of lifestyle. It's more personal. This is like I want to have a beer with George Bush kind of, but this is how people feel. They want to have an experience. This is why we're so compelled to watch these reality shows, I think. Reason itself is often heartless and uncompelling. I mean, that's kind of scary as a scientist to read that, right? Because it's like you would never say this. You probably would never say this. The first article supported by scientific evidence and based on reason. Reason itself is often heartless and uncompelling. It's hard to hear, but you need to understand that's what people think. So, again, if you want to close the gap, you have to have these understandings. Again, qualitatively, people talked about using scientific evidence, and so these tended to be more of the empiricists. Yes. So my point, or the point I think of the take-home of this is that we have people who want to feel, they want a personal emotional connection, and we also have people who really are rational who also want this kind of logic. They want it to be, they're tired of anecdotes, or not tired, anecdotes don't resonate with them. So moving to this third sort of construct or category is that climate change is not only about numbers and scientific facts, which are important, but also about observations and the effects of climate change. This is a quote that some student typed in when we asked why. All right. So this is what I want to get at with folks too, is that if the idea is to close this gap between science, advances in science, and public opinion, you gotta have a very diverse way of talking to people. Of course, when you talk to each other and in the own advancements of your science, it's going to be very technical. I think it's our obligation, I know I'm sounding a little preachy, I think it's our obligation to make sure that we actually, and we were talking about this earlier with Sandra, we're not going to, if we go on Twitter, we only have so many characters, and you're going to have to be pretty simple, right? But I think the idea of this diverse perspective is pretty important. So we also talked about trust in sources. Here's the wicked good news. Trust of sources, so we had them rank. Who do you trust? Outstanding scientists came out number 1. Number 2 are educators. We are all scientists and educators. So I think the future looks good for our ability to actually have an impact. These folks came out all mishmash in the middle, media, internet, government officials. That was sort of, some people said yay, some people said no. Environmental groups, same. Least trustworthy energy companies. Okay, so what? If people think that climate change is upon us and that it won't affect them personally, remember the Gallup, then science communication needs to make it personal. I'm curious about what you think about that, because it may rub some of you wrong. But it is taking your understanding, which is really important, the advances in our climate change science out to make it understandable. So the challenge is to do so without exacerbating the idea that information is over-exaggerated. So that chicken's little, is that who it was? The sky is falling. It's lost a lot of credibility with over-exaggeration, or predictions that ended up being interpreted as over-exaggeration when they didn't come to fruition. So this is what people say. Communications need to be relatable. People need to be able to relate to them. They want evidence, right? They want to know what you know. And they do want both. They want both the relatable, the personal part, and the evidence. So back to politics mattering. Who are you communicating with? I mean, we talk about the public and it's like this entity, this out there. You can be pretty targeted. Politics matter. And I do think that as much as we can communicate with our decision makers in this kind of a diverse way, that it will impact our sort of dichotomous, citizen perspective on climate change. So just very quickly, other studies in the mix. Because I think stories matter, communication matters, I do study how we tell stories. Heroes matter in stories. If any of you guys have kids, you know that's who your kid wants to be, except for at Halloween. They want to be the villain. So, or maybe the victim, depends on how you look at it. But stories matter, so I do quantify these different aspects of story. I have a book coming out, edited volume coming out in December on narrative policy framework. It's, anyway, and then also working with Clem Exerta and Jeff Poole, Kelsey Jensko, if you guys know Kelsey at U of M, on this idea, on a proposal on this idea that we've got perception of risk and we have actual risk, and so how can we bring these together? Public opinion on climate change, we have our science, how can we bring them closer together? Okay, 15 minutes left. I did it. Thank you. Can you tell me your names? Because I know no one here, and I feel terrible about that.
I'm Jerry DeMarco. I'm in the physics department.
Awesome. Hi, Jerry.
Could you give an example of including diverse perspectives?
Oh. Well, all right, off the top of my head, I mean, so what would a diverse perspective mean? I think it would mean, firstly, I think you got to think about audience. So who would this be going out to? So whether it's, a Twitter feed or whether it is a letter to the editor, I think a diverse perspective includes your data, but it includes a kind of this link to how your data is felt on the ground. And I just think, Fabian in Extension has been doing work across the state, working with farmers on climate change. And he, actually, Eric, what does he, weren't you the one who told me about his work? Can you tell what he's doing with the farmers? I think this might help answer the
I don't
question.
know much, but he's using eye clickers and going out and asking people what they're using, seeing how they think about climate change, what the responses are to different languages about climate change.
So, well,
I think you're right. I think you include anecdotes, you include specific examples of real people and how they're being affected, which politicians have been doing for years. Science and those relatable stories in conjunction.
right. And there's always this, not always, there is this danger, and I think this has happened with, or I see it in the narrative work studies that I do, where science is used as a weapon. So you have interest groups, you have political officials who cherry pick science and who cherry pick anecdotes, right? So you can have a debate, the compelling anecdotal story along with some science in a debate. We see this in presidential debates, and it's very common. But I think it's different coming from scientists than it is coming from our elected officials when you're able to take your work and bring it to, if you can, bring it down or bring it to people's lives. And I know, like, downscaling climate data, this is like the whole drive is like people want to know what's going to happen in my pixel, and we aren't quite there yet. But we can talk around what some of those possibilities are at a very personal level, wet or dry in this case.
Paul Roche has a question.
Oh, hi, Paul.
Really long.
That's Paul.
Read it here. Oh, it's right here. Might want to read it out loud, because I don't know.
Okay, so hi, Paul. I'm glad you're on. Influence on making public opinion. Drafting model bills, mandating the teaching of climate change denial in public school systems. This is like religion in school, right? Texas State Board of Education proposal changes to textbooks that teach two sides of climate change debate. Yeah, this is like evolution too, right? It's really the same idea here. So, I'm going to kind of back up. In the 50s, we had a huge explosion of interest groups. People saw this as democracy in action because it was a way for people to organize and to express opinions and interests and to get their view onto a political agenda. And since the rise of interest groups, there have been, like Theodore Lowy is a very famous political scientist, and he calls it, and that he has a book called The End of Liberalism, and he really calls into question how democratic such interest groups are, and this is where the evolution of special interest groups have come from, in part. The idea that there are elite interests and nefarious elite interests at work representing public interests. Now, I don't want to necessarily step into that debate as much as to say I do think that I guess, Paul, I would say that I'm going to trust the democratic process in that there may be a bill that comes forward, and in Texas they have to teach both sides. Well, if I were in Texas and I had to teach both sides, I could use that as an opportunity, but it also it also may be that, we have laws that get passed, and we also have laws that are overturned, and we're seeing this with gay marriage right now, too. So part of this is the democratic process, and we have a very strong Tea Party movement that is working, as you know, with Citizens United, working at a local and state level, and they're very effective. And this is a part of, I think, a fallout there, or a result. Whether you agree or not with their viewpoints is less irrelevant to, I think, the democratic process. And I think maybe, Paul, that's where you're trying to get at, is how, if people use the democratic process to influence the public, what do I think about that? And there's an effect, but I'm going to trust people, and I'm going to trust the process. Yes.
So
Eli's dad. I'm already forgetting your
Eli's
name.
dad. Bill.
Bill.
Ecologist. So I went to the Joint Aquatic Science meeting this summer in Portland, and one of the plenary talks was from a fellow with a PhD in oceanographic studies who abandoned it to become a screenplay writer, and then went back into science and gave this talk and said the scientists are not good at narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And that was his main message, is that we as scientists need to be better at narrative. And I would argue that those Alex and various people that he mentioned on the board up there are not good at science, but really good at narrative.
Yes.
Right? And the message that you just gave is narrative is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
It's more important to get these messages across. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you think that, and that's coupled with scientific literacy running around 26%, right? So how do we as scientists become better at narrative?
It's got to be like bottom up, top down, right? You're right about scientific literacy. I mean, the idea of uncertainty is very uncomfortable for our public, yet it's our obligation, right, to, when we report our findings, that we understand that when we talk about our findings, that we have a certain degree of uncertainty. We always, well, almost always will, especially in social sciences. So bottom-up science literacy, absolutely, and it's frightening what's happening at our elementary and secondary high school education, secondary education, in terms of the sciences and the funding, particularly in contrast to when we were going to high school. But also, I think our institutional structures, what are we rewarded for? We're not rewarded to be good communicators. We just aren't. So there has to be a really large change, or you have to have a certain moral compass as a scientist to want to do that. And maybe it falls on the shoulders of professors, because they're there, and professors could be the ones to carry that mantle forward. Science communication is a huge discipline. And I think Kathy actually has done some work in science communication through the IOE also. But if it's of interest, we can continue to have these conversations about, I mean, how do you talk about complex science, methods, statistics, and results, and have it be a diverse narrative? Yeah, well, actually, Dave, and then, yeah, Stephanie, and then, yeah.
Well, I thought your use of the term proxy was interesting. And I think maybe climate change is a proxy. I think a big problem is that people don't think it's important to distinguish between knowledge and belief anymore. Because they're equally valid, and you can give the best narrative you've ever developed, and they'll listen and say, but that's not what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the end of the discussion, because they don't distinguish between knowledge and belief.
Well, and when you think about what goes into an opinion, values are someone's values. Those are hard to budge. But the place that we can have, and we were talking about this with our proposal, the place that we can have an input is at the knowledge level. And knowledge does change. It does change beliefs. We used to be a cigarette-smoking nation. Now we're not. as much. Yeah, Stephanie.
One thing I think is interesting as a teacher and a senior level social class is that increasingly it seems like information is political. Like if I talk about the global nitrogen cycle, it's political to assert that humans are having an influence. And what is striking to me in my class sometimes is that people read those political, but I understand them to be understanding it as political indicators of my politics and where I'm coming from. And don't question them. They simply, and so if I think about what I would like to see different in that situation, it's something like the dialogue. The tendency to ask, like, I realize, like, what you're saying sounds political to me. You're telling me that you believe in climate change, or you're telling me they're reading in a subtext that is very, just seems increasingly suspicious. And I wonder what you think about that for educators.
Well, and I think particularly with regard to climate change, it is politicized. I mean, that's what jumps out on the, in any survey as the, one of the most influential factors is a political leaning. And again, I'm going back to Martin and I, these ideas of a policy surrogate, that it is so charged that we're finding language substitutes. So when we were working on a sage grouse, right, Rick, this is what the agency folks said. We can't talk about climate change, but we can talk about drought. So we've adapted to different kinds of substitutes, but you're correct. We have not been willing to have the debate because at this point we're so polarized that well, I think we're afraid to have the debate because we're not very good at talking to each other anymore. And secondly, it's scary for people. So we find poor substitutes. But, well, I don't know if they're poor. We find substitutes. Yeah. Can you tell me your name?
Jason.
Jason.
So if part of your story is that there's this divide between what people think and what scientists know, and we need better narratives to kind of bridge the gap. Is climate change any better or worse than other polarized issues?
That we need better narratives to decrease that. And is climate change any better or worse than other issues?
So, someone mentioned evolution. So, right, there's kind of what scientists know and what people perceive, and there's a gap between that.
Yeah, and I think that because evolution is so immersed in a religious context, that's probably even more intractable. I have more hope with our climate change information and understanding, and that will evolve over time. It is a political issue, but I also think that this is, again, I'm putting this on scientists. I know this sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but that that we have to keep, and ClimateGate didn't help, right? And so people will throw that around sort of like Benghazi and Clinton, will she ever get over it? But we have to, and be persistent. And I'm the youngest child, so I just keep saying the same thing again and again, and it really works. I'm very good at getting my way. Can you tell me your name?
Hi, Mike Lynch. I actually work with the Alumni Foundation.
Okay.
In terms of the survey data that you get, or that you've gathered, does it tell us anything about the audiences who could be targeting messages towards people who might be more likely to, not the most receptive people and not the most resistant people, but the people who might take it, internalize it, and it could begin to shift their opinion, or they could take it as knowledge.
Exactly. So, I mean, I do have some ideas about that, but really with the lab, for example, this is where we'll be doing experiments so that we can better target and we can better understand messaging. So, and that's a part of our proposal too for NSF is, okay, so we have these information, but how do we know who's going to be receptive to what? So it's a great question. I can't quite answer it in a picky way right now, but it's exactly where we're going with it.
Because I think knowing the audience first will help us determine what the narrative sounds like.
Yep. Excellent point.
Maybe I need to start. You think
go, or where are you going to I haven't looked at, I don't know. That has not been a part, that wasn't one of the independent variables in, for gals or for what we did because we were looking at students. Well, I shouldn't say that. It would have been an interesting question. But that is a typical variable as well as race. But again, we tend to be pretty homogeneous here, so I didn't report those data. I do have those data. But it's a good, so once you have, are you thinking once you have kids, your perspective changes? Is that where you're going with that? Yeah.
I just want to ask a really long question. Like, if you could coach the MSU administration right now and have a closed door meeting with them, would you say, look, we don't bring this up right now. We're still figuring out exactly the right narrative, how to do it. Or would you say, get in there, engage, what would you have a little strategy session?
Yeah, I would say that we're in a leadership position, and we should be engaging, and we should not be afraid. And we should not be afraid necessarily, well, it's easy for me to say, of making, well, we're going to offend, and I think that's okay, that we need to take a stand. We need to take a stand. And we have a lot of science going on here that supports this perspective. So I think MSU has an opportunity to be that leader. So I wouldn't wait, but I also, we're going to continue to do our social science to understand what works best.
Make an assumption that the scientists, as you were describing them, are those people that think quantitatively as opposed to those that are trained as scientists. Is that a correct assumption?
Wait, say that again, that the scientists in the survey are
Those that think quantitatively as opposed to those that are actually trained, per se, as scientists.
they are being trained in quantitative methods and analyses.
Part of where I'm going with this is if we were to focus on providing more of a narrative, a more qualitative kind of story to the public, do we have the threat of losing the scientists and presenting that information that way?
No.
Alienating them.
Well, I would hope not, I guess, because if by having, and I think that we saw in the qualitative data that the anecdotal or the personal was too squeaky and not very effective or compelling or trustworthy for them. They're pretty clear about that. However, I think the idea is that with diverse narratives or diverse presentation of data and sort of operationalizing how that data looks on the ground, then we don't know, we probably should test that too, but you would capture both. Because even when you read a story, like, you could read a story, same news story, you and your spouse, and you get different things out of it, you get similar things out of it. So you're still going to gravitate toward what you're interested in and understanding and reading.